Yeah, good morning. It's 6 p.m. in Catania, Sicily, and Rita, you go with 9 a.m. in Berkeley, and we're starting the webinar. I'm sorry we're late. There were like some technical problems, and we're still waiting for the head of the department. I think she was not able to get connected. I just got a message from her, and I'm very happy and pleased to be part of this beginning of exchange between the two departments, the Department of Human Science and the Department of Near Eastern Studies and Classical Studies. That will be part of the agreement between UC Berkeley and University of Catania. We hope that showing to the students and researchers interested in ancient funerary rituals, this will bring about possible exchange programs between our archaeological research at the University of Catania and projects run by scholars at the UC Berkeley. And I will leave the words to Rita, that will probably read some words from the head of department at the Near Eastern Studies.
Yes, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, for those who are watching on YouTube. And yes, so our chair of the Near Eastern Studies Department, Francesca Rockberg, could not be with us due to another compelling meeting, but I will read the text that she wrote for this event. So dear colleagues, I regret that due to another Zoom meeting, I cannot make my welcome in virtual person for the webinar, The Archaeology of Death, that Professors Rita Lucarelli and Nicola Lanieri have organized today. On behalf of the Department of Near Eastern Studies, UC Berkeley, I want to extend my welcome to everyone and to thank Rita and Professor Lanieri for putting this webinar together to launch the exciting new international cooperation between UC Berkeley and the Università degli Studi di Catania. I also want to thank Sara Kansa and Niko Tripcevic from the Archaeological Research Facility of UC Berkeley for generously live streaming the webinar on their YouTube channel. I hope this will be just the first of many collaborations on Near Eastern and Mediterranean antiquity between colleagues at our two universities. And I hope too that when travel is possible again, we will meet and share our work in person. And indeed, I also wish to join our chair and thank the Archaeological Research Facility of UC Berkeley for hosting this meeting on their very active and inspiring YouTube channel full of other videos and live streamed events on archaeological research, not only at UC Berkeley, but in the whole world. And I also want to say that I think that the speakers here today not only sharing common interest in the study of the ancient world, but we are also very lucky scholars for working and teaching in two beautiful and historical universities, but also in two scenic regions such as Sicily, Catania, and the Bay Area of California and Berkeley in particular. Our campuses and regions really deserve to be visited and experienced in full and in person by us, by scholars, and by our students. And this is why with this agreement, we really hope that we can create new study exchange programs, conferences, and other cooperations between scholars of the two universities. And so that said, I think I'll give the word to the first speaker.
Sorry, Rita. I just got a message from the head of the department. She has internet connection problems. She wants just to thank you, to thank all your colleagues and the head of the department. And she's happy, and she wants to acknowledge the fact that everything started because we invited Rita Lucarelli to teach Egyptology in our department, and was a great success. The students are very happy, and she hopes to see all the other colleagues, all your other colleagues in Catania, and hopefully more American students, students from Berkeley, to come to Catania and join our archaeological projects, and hopefully Sicilian students from the University of Catania to join your projects and also come to Berkeley. So I'll give you, thank you again.
Thank you indeed. We really hope that in a new world without pandemics, of course. And yes, I'm going to give the words to the first speaker of today, Pietro Militello, Professor of Aegean Archaeology at the Department of Humanities of the University of Catania, who has published extensively on the writing systems as well on the material culture in the Aegean world, interconnections between the Aegean world and Sicily during the Bronze and Iron Ages, but I'm sure he can even better than me present himself. And Pietro, let me know when start the slides for your presentation. I think he's still mute.
Okay, can you hear now?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me here to share my experience in the field of archaeology of death. I will introduce myself. I'm an Aegean archaeologist, as you said, and I'm currently working in Crete as director of the excavations in Sestos and Agia Triada. But my main interests in Crete are about the realm of the living, palatial administration and architecture. Therefore, for the topic of this meeting, Archaeology of Death, I decided to present researches I'm currently carrying on in Italy. Being also interested in the wider aspects of Mediterranean prehistory, since 2012, I have started excavations in 2 Sicilian sites characterized by the presence of a necropolis, Calaforno and Calicantone. Now, if we can go on with the slide.
So yes, 1 minute, I will share it soon. Okay.
Okay, so I see the presentation slide, next one. Okay, perfect. Both sites are set in the area of the Iblean Mountains in southeastern Sicily, characterized by calcareous rock and small canyons, locally called cave, suitable to host large villages of rock-cut dwellings and a large necropolis of rock-cut tombs. But beyond these shared features, the 2 sites differ in the morphology of tombs and in the preservation of the archaeological evidence, leading therefore to different approaches and different projects because archaeology of death has many nuances, and for each of these sites we have to make a choice between these different approaches. Calicantone lays on the western edge of the Cavadistica Gorge. The project started in 2012 in collaboration with the Soprintendenza di Ragusa. The archaeological area is made up by the village, the necropolis, and a biapsidal dwelling between the two. The village has been destroyed by modern building activity in the 70s, and few evidence survives. The hut resulted to be a building 12 meters long, full of pottery, mainly storage containers and pouring vessels, with some shapes represented by more than 30 samples. It served, therefore, to host communal activities. Here we found the skeletons of at least 12 individuals. The majority of them died of a violent death for the collapse of the building, perhaps due to human or to natural event. But at least one corpse was present, but preserved in an extended position. And so it looked at the hut could be used for the preparation of the corpse. Starting from the necropolis, on the contrary, is made up by 93 tombs, scattered rock-cut tombs, scattered along the gorge, which were, however, looted in antiquity. So only very few preserved layers remain. Therefore, we had to concentrate not so much on the analysis of remains of pottery, but we concentrated on spatial analysis and visual analysis. in order also to fill a gap in the scientific knowledge of Sicilian prehistory. Until now, interest of archaeologists for Sicilian prehistoric tombs was mainly devoted to the morphological and chronological study, with less attention paid to landscape setting. We wanted, on the contrary, reconstruct the inner organization of the necropolis, not only from a social point of view, but also from a physical point of view. It turned out that the tombs are grouped on 14 rocky ridges containing from 2 to 11 funerary units per cluster. The clusters were linked by footpaths and steps cut in the rock. A restricted area left in front of the entrance of each tomb left space only for a few people, suggesting a ritual with restricted access. But in each cluster, it is possible to detect the existence of some facilities, like niches, probably to be used by all the tombs of the same cluster. Clustering of tombs, morphological differentiation from a more elaborate to more simple facades, and also different accessibility, seem to stress the existence of internal differentiation and competition within the social group, notwithstanding the substantial egalitarian structure of early Bronze Age Sicilian society. Next slide, please. Visual analysis stressed how tombs were conceived to be seen especially by people from the opposite side of the gorge, representing therefore a territorial mark. On the contrary, the necropolis and the village were not visible to each other, while the hut formed a clear reference point within the settlement system, as it was visible from both the village and from the tombs. Starting from this data, an analysis of the ritual landscape of Calicantone has been attempted. A ritual space can be identified, divided at least into two different areas. The first one consists of the necropolis. The second ritual area relates to the hut, which lay directly between the village and the necropolis.
Ti stai per collegare?
Sorry? No, not next time. Go back. Okay. So the hut might have been perceived as a border or demarcation zone between life and death. Now, next slide. The next slide, please. Okay. The second site is the hypogeum of Calaforno, situated in the so-called Contrada Manna, inside the Calaforno's Forest Park, in a wonderful landscape of a protected fauna and flora. The hypogeum is one of the most important funerary structures in prehistoric Sicily, but no systematic research was carried out until our investigations in 2013, in collaboration always with the Soprintendenza di Ragusa. The hypogeum consists of a wide entrance and 35 rooms, creating an impressive underground complex of a type until now unknown in Sicily. The main problem of the hypogeum is its long history. It started as a funerary area. The first chambers were excavated in the final Copper Age around 2500 BC, the last ones in the early Bronze Age, towards 1700 BC. From the Middle Bronze Age to the early Iron Age, some of the chambers were used for cultic activities, probably libations in honor of the dead. At some time in the first millennium, the main entrance was blocked and cult activity concentrated on the outside. From the 4th century AD, some of the chambers were used as a Christian hypogeum, and later on, in the early medieval age, as storerooms or working areas. Earlier layers were disturbed or even erased up to the rock. It was therefore not possible to recover all information we could expect in such a case. So in the case of Calaforno, our interest focused on a different approach and 3 different goals. The first one was a digital survey of the whole hypogeum to provide an updated tool for a deeper analysis of the architecture and technique of construction. The second was the study of energetic for the construction of the hypogeum in order to calculate possible amount of man labor employed and the number of people belonging to the original community. Next slide, please. Next slide. The third goal is to reproduce what is called corporeality. It has to reconstruct the physical experience within the hypogeum at the time of its use, from temperature and humidity to sound and visual perception in the darkness. Finally, next slide. Another opportunity of research has been given by a systematic study of the human remains undertaken by Francesco Giavazzi and Elena Varotto of the FAPAB Research Center and the Flinders University. Results look very interesting, providing unexpected insights. Cut marks on some bones made after death seem to hint at the praxis of defleshing of the body, in some cases after some period after death, suggesting secondary practices of burial. In other cases, cut marks were made just before the death, suggesting a violent death and posing the problem of conflicts in a period traditionally considered of a peaceful coexistence. Finally, next slide. Paleopathological analysis brought to light the existence of congenital diseases, periostitis and tumors such as this osteochondroma, which you can see at the center of the slide, providing new data on the health conditions in the later Copper Age or early Bronze Age Sicily. So this is my contribution to the seminar. Obviously, I'm ready to answer any question if there will be anyone, and I will pass to the other speaker. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Militello. And indeed, we will have time for questions at the end. For now, I'll give the word to the second speaker, Professor Kim Shelton, Associate Professor of Classics, Director of the Nemea Center for Classical Archaeology. And Kim directs 3 excavations, actually, programs in Greece, and is a specialist in ceramics, material culture, and mortuary landscapes. Please, Kim.
Thank you, Rita, and thank you very much for the invitation to join this group. I don't see myself, so that's probably fine. But hopefully everyone can hear me. So of the 3 projects that I run in Greece, they actually all appear on this map, which is one reason why I'm able to work on all 3 projects. But what is particularly relevant to the subject of this group is, of course, mortuary archaeology, is the site of Aidonia, which, as you see here, is located in the northeastern part of the Peloponnese, the area of the southwest Corinthia. It is an area that in a certain part of its history, in what we call the Mycenaean palatial period, so approximately between 1400 and 1200 BCE, this region seems to have been part of the larger kingdom of Mycenae, which you can see here is just to the southeast of it. And these areas were also, as I've marked here, significant through the Iron Age and into the Archaic period, and in varying degrees. So they all sort of interact with one another through these periods in a kind of continuous way. Some of them through settlements, but also through the mortuary landscape. Next slide, please. The site of Aidonia became known, unfortunately, through extensive looting that started in the late 1970s and went on through the first part of the 1980s, with the Greek Archaeological Service able to conduct salvage excavations throughout that period. It became particularly well known in the early 1990s when a group of material from this cemetery, what has been called the Aidonia treasure, was put up for sale, came out for sale at a gallery in New York. And that sale was eventually blocked and the material repatriated back to Greece. Combined with the material from the salvage excavations, there's been a pretty strong understanding of the importance of this site, mostly though through the objects themselves, many of which you can see on this image, including gold signet rings, precious, semi-precious seal stones, works in cloisonne and other inlay. and also an early plan of these tombs. The original ones that were either looted or discovered through salvage excavation include 20 mortuary features. About 16 of them are the traditional Mycenaean chamber tomb that you see one of the entrances to here on the image, and one also that shows the quite overgrown state in which they have become, because the site has not, although is an archaeological site, it has not been expropriated as of yet, so is still privately owned and had not been as consistently maintained over the years, which led to the fact that looting did continue over the years and intensified significantly during the economic crisis in the late 2000s. Rita, next slide, please. So this led to a request by the Greek Archaeological Service to the Nemea Center of UC Berkeley to collaborate with them and try to do more for the site, save the site on the one hand, and help stop the looting, continue the excavations in a systematic way, and then also prepare the site for eventual expropriation and presentation to the to visitors, including we've designed there, I've illustrated here, an old abandoned schoolhouse nearby the site that we're going to convert into a visitor center, interpretive center that will really be centered on the history of the site, which is so enmeshed with illegal activity and looting and the loss of material, cultural material, but also intellectual material. So we started our work with the survey in 2014, and you see a plan that resulted from that, including all types of interesting archaeological features beyond the cemetery itself. In fact, we identified, in addition to the cemetery that's been known since the 1970s, 2 additional cemeteries or clusters of chamber tombs that we're now calling the upper cemetery, the middle cemetery, which is the original one known from the 1970s, and the lower cemetery. And we began systematic excavations in 2015, and I didn't change my slide. We were supposed to have our last season this summer. Obviously, that's been postponed. Yeah, go ahead. Next slide. That's good. So we found a very interesting range of chamber tombs. One of the things that developed from the salvage excavations was that we have a good understanding of the variety of chamber tomb architecture and burial architecture that were available to the residents of Idonia, including some pretty monumental sized chamber tombs, some of them very well cut out of the bedrock. And there were also alternate features that could be produced, including long trenches which resemble the entrance to one of these chamber tombs, and yet there was no doorway, there was no chamber. They just used that long trench for burial. And there was one instance of a type of tomb that is much more known on Crete, which is often referred to as a pit cave. It's at the bottom of a deep shaft, and then you have a chamber opening off the bottom. That's very unusual for this part of the Mycenaean world. So maybe showing some interaction with Crete in this period. So we've been able to go on and expand because of our systematic excavations, and not only find additional tombs, but a number of tombs that were not disturbed in any way. And that includes modern looting, but also ancient intervention. We have uncovered a few tombs that show significant interaction in especially the Archaic period. And it looks like some of these tombs were accidentally discovered and identified likely during this period of interest in the Homeric heroic past, that they believe these were tombs of the heroes, and they become areas of worship and veneration and little hero shrines. And so we find the material that reflects that, both installations and figurines, for instance. We also, unfortunately, have found tombs that have been very disturbed. The one that you see here on the bottom right of the screen, beautifully carved tomb, actually very well preserved, was totally looted. And we didn't have either human remains or artifacts that came from that tomb at all, unfortunately. The opposite of that is the one you see in the center, which is one of our earliest tombs from the site and is a really massive monumental tomb. And although used much later in time, the collapse of the tomb, since that's why we're looking at it from above, because the ceiling had collapsed, is protected the original late Bronze Age material, and that was found entirely intact. Next slide, please. And I'm using here Tomb 100 to illustrate the situation that we had. There you have a plan here of Tomb 100, a very typical Mycenaean chamber tomb cut into the bedrock. This one was cut into a very soft area of bedrock that we have on the site, and so had partially collapsed. You can see at the bottom right what it looked like when we found it. It had absolutely been partially looted, it had been entered into earlier in time, and then had been used as a dump for garbage for quite a long period of time. So I illustrate here first two pieces of garbage that were found in part of the artifacts that we collected and the overall life history of this tomb, which went right up to the point where we started excavating it. And I also am illustrating what is, yes, a Coca-Cola bottle. This was found at the burial level of the tomb, only about 70 centimeters from one of our burial features, and is able to be dated to the early 1990s. So dates when the tomb was entered and robbed. And we don't know, in fact, if they got anything at all because of the heavy collapse. Go ahead, next slide, Rita. Because in fact, what we ended up finding.
I think this is the last one.
No, this should go away. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Yes.
So instead, because of the collapse, again, we think almost all, if not all, of the original burials were in fact underneath and were not robbed. And they included, as you can see here, quite long span of burial activity from about 1500 to 1375 BCE. And what that showed to us, and it's sort of a good example of what we've been finding in all the tombs that we excavate, is a very interesting selection of burial choices, some that are primary burials, some that remain primary burials throughout the history of the tomb, others that become secondary burial activities and are treated in different ways. In the West Burial Platform, for instance, we had the bones very carefully curated with all of the skulls lined up together at the bottom of a pit, and then all of the long bones laid on top of it. And other areas in the pit were much more haphazard and commingled. You can't really identify individual features of individual burials. And we also found in this as our first example of what we call a warrior's kit, a selection of weapons and tools that accompany some of what seem to be perhaps the more elite or more important burials on the site. So again, I just wanted to illustrate one example that is typical of the kinds of things that we're finding. A wealth of material culture, absolutely. Able to identify that with individual burials and mortuary habits is particularly important, as that is totally missing from the earlier site. But even, and maybe most importantly, as we now have at least 50 individuals that we're able to study osteologically and bioarchaeologically, and we'll be able to say something about the population of this area, which has not been possible up to this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim, for this very interesting presentation. So as I said, we will have time for questions at the end. Now I'd like to give the word to our third speaker, Simona Todaro, researcher of prehistory and proto-history of the Mediterranean and funerary culture in the Aegean world and in Sicily in the Bronze Age. Please, Simona. You're on mute.
Thank you. I'm not very awake, despite the fact that in Catania it's 6:30 at the moment. So hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. And just in addition to your presentation, I can say that I'm a researcher of Mediterranean prehistory, but the focus of my research has been mainly the Aegean and Crete. I'm an active member of the mission working in Crete ever since 1996. I started as a student of Catania University, and it's been a long way ever since. And as part of the mission, my role has been trying to reconstruct the earliest phases of occupation of two sites, Festos and Agia Triada. And the first one starts in the end of beginning of 5th millennium, and the second one instead is at the end of the 4th millennium. And it hasn't been easy, especially in the case of Festus. It's been particularly difficult because Festus is known in the Aegean for being the place of two Menon palaces that has been built one on top of the other. So it's a tell site. And so the investigation of the earliest level has been extremely difficult and has been carried out in 3 major excavation seasons. Now there is the 4th one, which is directed by the Professor Militello. And so piecing together all these little pieces has entailed working with more than 180 stratigraphies underneath the palaces. But apart from that, it has been rewarding, and because the figures after these 20 years of research has changed dramatically in comparison when I started. So if you can advance the PowerPoint, I will try and explain which type of site is Festus. Well, it's very deceiving because when I arrived at Festus, I saw this wonderful tell site, which was already an elevated site to start with, so dominating this alluvial plain, wonderful. And it was presented by earlier scholars as an inland site, as a typical Neolithic site, which, however, was built on the top of the hill as a consequence of some sort of threat, which was supposed to be driven by the arrival of newcomers. And with time and researching also other work done by geologists working in Greece, it turned out that Festus, when it was established at the end of the 6th millennium, was a coastal site. And it was a coastal site set on a hill overlooking a wetland. And it was very different from these Neolithic sites which we were entailing, especially because the earlier traces of activity were intermittent. It was not a settlement. It was very difficult to understand what it was because the stratigraphy showed pattern of activity and then abandonment and then activity. And the deposits were not domestic by any means. And so then if you advance the PowerPoint, you can see that with time, it became clear that rather than being these sort of refugee sites, expression of the Cretans that has decided to leave the plain because of the arrival of newcomers. It was instead a sort of open air site, which it was frequented periodically by people arriving from the sea, earlier metal and mineral prospectors, who periodically were going here, finding particularly perfidious because of the presence of the wetland. And then after this going on activity, at some point, some of these decided to settle. And so we have within 400 or 500 years of this periodic and intermittent activity, we have the earliest appearance of structure, which is a circular structure, which I'm trying to point with my pointer. I don't know if is in display, but it's B in the PowerPoint. and another structure which instead is an A. They are just, as you can understand, just small traces of walls. But the rest, it was just open air with strange assemblages where what was clear, it was this activity of pouring and pouring liquid and using of red ochre. And then there was these adult human remains. I have to say that although I participated actively at the latest excavation, these burial remains, these human remains had been excavated in the 60s. So for me, it was like dealing with legacy excavation. And in all honesty, when I was putting together the site, I limited myself to state the presence of these. And because the site at this point appeared to be a settlement, I thought that it could be regarded as an intramural burial. And it was only afterwards, when I was exposed to the work of Sefi Triandafilo, who is a professor, associate professor at the University of Salonicco, who published this article, Living with the Dead, and in which all the practices regarding the burial in the Neolithic sites of Greece had been put together, that I started thinking that probably I could do something with this. I could do more than just stating the presence of intramural burial. First of all, because what was strange about this one, it was the fact that it was laid on a bed of red ochre. And now this is common, but not in this period. It's very, I mean, the use of red ochre in burial in the Western Mediterranean disappeared after the 4th millennium. And in Greece, we only have a case attested in the Mesolithic period, but it was not very common. So if you can advance the slide, after, yes, double click, thank you. I was starting to understand how it could work together with the material assemblages that it was surrounding. And I noticed that there was not only the red ochre used to decorate the vessel, but the red ochre was profusely found, and also the skull was completely found full of red ochre. And at that point, I decided to contact Enrica Fiandra, who passed away, unfortunately, a couple of months ago. But in 2010, I contacted her and I asked her, because she excavated the skeleton, and I asked her if she had more information that could provide me that. Also because near the skeleton, I don't know if it's visible in this slide, unfortunately it's not a good image, there was this triton shell which has been cut at one hand, and so probably used as an instrument, and it was also decorated with red ochre. And thanks to Enrica Fiandra, if you advance the slides, I obtained a series of further photos and indication of what was actually found. And so she told me that she was the one discovering the skeleton, that the skeleton was not a primary burial. It was a secondary burial because only long bones and the skull was found. She also told me that this skull lacked the lower mandible, which has been replaced by a stone. And then it was all covered with these blocks of stone that are visible in the second imaging from the top, on top of the legs. And so I started researching and understanding what it could be. It was clearly a secondary burial, but she told me that it was not found within a pit. And actually she sent for analysis the red ochre that it was found underneath. And she discovered that it was part of limestone. So it was like lying on a floor. And so what seems probable is that there was something going on. So all the ochre containers that have been found around this area and the ochre that it was laid on the skull, it seems to have stopped a moment in time in which they were doing something with the skeleton. But what they were doing with the skeleton, it was really unique in the sense like one part of the skeleton, as it can be seen, it's fragmented. And I thought that it could be like due to the excavation or to manipulation, or like during later activity at the site. Instead, she confirmed that it was clearly like broken. At the time, it didn't make sense, but then as the studies on the Neolithic burial practice proceeds, and as the publication of the necropolis at Cepi was brought forward, it becomes really more interesting, because in the necropolis at Cepi, which is a site in Attica, it is interesting to find that some of the skeleton had a stone inside the mouth, and this skeleton have always the skull completely damaged by some sort of, with a hammer or something. It's voluntary, deliberately broken. And these appear as to be deviant burial. So I started researching to see why, and if this could be a deviant burial. The fact that it is a unique skeleton within a site that had just become a settlement at the time in which other burial were done in caves, it was already opening up a perspective. It could have been just a case of relocation of some of the bones within the settlement. Is something that is attested also later on. So when I start putting together all the information, I decided to start and focusing on specific treatment to see what was that continued in Crete and what was instead unique. Now, for the lack of the mandible and the presence of the stone, the mandible is always lacking, but this is something that is related to the very act of disarticulation, because normally it remains attached to the neck. But the placing of a stone in the mouth is not common at all. And red ochre is something that disappeared in the Aegean in the Mesolithic. And it was also this Mesolithic connection that opened up a sort of better understanding, because after all, this could be the burial of the people, of one of the people who first settled the site. So in terms of future perspective, I started trying to see if it could help me tracing the origin of the first settler of the site. And in this, the connection with Marula has been very interesting, because it's on the Cyclades, on an island of Kythnos, and it provided, it's a Mesolithic site, so it's 2,000 years earlier than the skeleton. It had provided red ochre, it had provided the use of stone. But what is even more interesting is that some of the skeleton at Maroulas, according to the analysis that has been done, revealed a distinctive pathology in the skull, which proves that those people were exposed to thalassemia. They had this disease. So that kind of lit the light, because if you show the last slide, can you advance? Yeah. What is becoming clear in the environmental reconstruction of the site is that the wetland that it was around Festus, at some point, it kind of was alternating period of fresh water and period of dead water. So it was a wetland that alternatively became a swamp, and therefore it was not very good for a living condition. And the fact that we found this skeleton with these distinctive burial practices that connect to Maroulas, and the fact that some of the individuals at Maroulas appear to have suffered of thalassemia, and the fact that just building up very recently, it has been proved that alpha thalassemia is something that is not deadly and prevent malaria from attacking people. And so it could allow living in a wetland where the conditions were not open. It just gave me the idea of starting a project, hopefully with the collaboration of Savitri and Philo, to try and see if there are traces on the skull that could open up the possibility of seeing if the first settler of the site were somehow really related to these people, these Mesolithic people from Marula, that were carrying the gene that allowed them to settle for the first time in this environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Simona, for your fascinating presentation. I think it's time for me to introduce the co-host. It was like Simona is a very interesting, and I read some comments, with Ines also, it's like very fascinating because you were able to reconstruct, paleopathological aspects of this funerary, secondary funerary burial system, but also like the reconstructing ancient environments. It's like, seems like a very fascinating project that combine landscape analysis with funerary analysis and the analysis of festos. So now let me introduce the co-host of this webinar. Rita Lucarelli is Associate Professor of Egyptology and has been also lent to Catania for this semester. And so she's been the perfect link between UC Berkeley and the University of Catania. And she's going to talk about two projects that she's been interested during the last years. Thank you, Rita, for organizing this.
Thank you, Nicola, for your kind presentation. And indeed, I am bringing everyone now from Greece to Egypt. And for those of you who know me, they knew that I've been working a lot, actually, not really on a site, but on text, mostly on text of the ancient Egyptian so-called Book of the Dead. And indeed, my main project at UC Berkeley is the sketchy title of the Book of the Dead in 3D. Why? Because, well, this corpus of spell, the Book of the Dead, mostly known for its version on papyri, is also attested on other media, 3D medias, and I choose coffins to work on how the text and the iconography of those magical spells, as well as spells of similar type, are used to decorate ancient Egyptian coffins. And so since 2015, actually, the Book of the Dead in 3D project is based at UC Berkeley and aims at implementing the 3D visualizations of ancient Egyptian coffins, kept primarily at the museum for which I'm also faculty curator for the Egyptian collection, the Fibe Earth Museum of Anthropology, which has actually the biggest Egyptian collection in North America. And we are working at the digitization of the whole collection. I'm focusing on the coffins, creating 3D models, but annotating those models with metadata that can tell us about the origin of the coffins, their history, the name of the owners, and in particular the translation of the magical text on the coffins. And techniques of digital capture and 3D visualization, in particular photogrammetry, are currently widely used in Egyptology in order to create replicas of all kinds of objects, as well as for reconstructing also archaeological sites, tombs and temples. Museums are using 3D viewers such as Sketchfab in order to disseminate their collection, and ancient Egyptian artifacts constitutes a good part of these 3D online replicas. Now with my project, indeed, I'm focusing on creating annotations, since the coffins, especially the anthropoid coffins produced in the first millennium BC, really are decorated with very interesting variants of funerary text, of those spells that should protect the deceased during the journey in the netherworld, according to the ancient Egyptian beliefs. So having annotated 3D models is also a very good educational tool to have students working also maybe on the Egyptian language, if they want to follow Egyptian language courses that we offer at UC Berkeley, but they are also useful for the museum visitors, and those coffins of the Earth Museum, as well as of the other small museums, small collections in California, where we've been working, they are not on exhibitions. They are in storage rooms. So disseminating them through digital viewers, where one can indeed enjoy the full object, flip it around, as well as read about the text, and the translation is an optimal way to supply to the lack of space in museums to exhibit those beautiful artifacts. And so this is an example of the annotations. In the previous slides, there was a link to the website of the project, 3D Coffins Berkeley EDU, which I don't have time to show to you today, but I invite everybody to check the website. In many cases, you can even download the PDF versions of those 3D models of coffins, or you can look at those online with the all annotations. So I'm working on this with a team of students and colleagues that are helping with that. And today in particular, I want to present to you my first case study, the first sarcophagus on which I've been working, which is a beautiful, actually, sarcophagus lid of an official lived during the 26th dynasty in the north of Egypt, and his tomb is known, is found in Saqqara. So we are here around 500 BC. We call him the doctor because one of his titles is indeed Sunu, in Egyptian doctor, but those Sunu at this time, they were also high officials, military men, and indeed the tomb has never been filled. We think that Psamtik probably died during a military expedition maybe, but the tomb was ready. It was one of these beautiful tomb shafts of the period. So this is, here you can see some a photo of me and a student starting to photograph this beautiful and heavy, 2 tons heavy sarcophagus lid, when at the time when it was still in the storage, in one of the storage rooms of the museum off-site in Richmond, thanks to crowdfunding campaign. And under the, at the time, still the director of the museum was Benjamin Porter, who is one of the next speakers today, who's been doing an amazing job in supporting such a campaign and bring back the sarcophagus lid in our gallery space, where it's still today. In the meantime, I've been working in to create a 3D model of this sarcophagus lid, and I've been working, of course, to the translation of the text of this sarcophagus, which is similar. It's made of spells, similar to the Book of the Dead, mostly of the pyramid text type. This sarcophagus has been then the basis of a second phase of the Book of the Dead in 3D project, which is still ongoing, that is called Return to the Tomb, contextualizing the Egyptian sarcophagus of Psamtik in a 4D visualization of the tomb and its environment at Saqqara in Dynasty 26. And this is a collaborative project with a colleague from UC Santa Cruz, Helen Sullivan, Chris Hoffman, who has been managing the project at UC Berkeley. I saw on YouTube is online, so hi Chris. And the project has been generously funded by the Center of Information Technology Research in the Interest of Society, CITRIS, and the Banatawi Institutes. So Helen Sullivan is a digital Egyptologist specialized in reconstructing, digitally reconstructing funerary sites, and she's been recently publishing a book, Constructing the Sacred, which is available online if you want to check as well, where you can see this interactive reconstruction, the necropolis of Saqqara. We have been using the visualization that Helen made of the 26th dynasty Saqqara. That was the period when the tomb of Psamtik was built, that you can see here in the reconstruction we've been made, thanks to an amazing team also of students that help using these softwares for both for photogrammetry like Metashape and VR. For the reconstructions for VR, we've been using Unity. And so we reconstruct basically the landscape, the tomb, and brought back the sarcophagus in the tomb. In this way, this is a way through apps like this in VR to make sure that the objects that nowadays are decontextualized in museums can virtually be brought back in their own environment. And I think this is one of the most amazing function that digital technologies have in archaeology. And so I wanted to show you quickly 2 minutes demo of what we've been doing for this VR app that we hope to launch by the end of this year. And of course, for the full experience, you will need a headset and really travel into the tomb. But I hope this will give you an idea, and I hope also the audio will be on. It should.
To the ancient Saqqara necropolis.
Okay.
Saqqara was an important cemetery site that stood in the high desert west of the city of Memphis, a religious, economic, and political center. It is the 26th dynasty, otherwise known as the Saite period, 664 to 525 BCE, when high officials and families of the elite from the now state capital Sais wanted to be buried near the pyramids of the powerful pharaohs of the past. For example, the famous step pyramid of Djoser, or the pyramid of King Unas, both built more than 1,500 years before the Saite period. You are now standing before a series of 26 dynasty shaft tombs, marked at the surface by square enclosure walls. 26 dynasty shaft tombs were often designed with a long, narrow shaft dug into the ground, ending in a burial chamber. Psamtik's tomb shaft extended more than 25 meters deep into the rock of the Saqqara Plateau. After the burial chamber was built and in place, the shaft was filled with sand to make the tomb inaccessible. Click on the hieroglyphs to view their translation. Thank you for visiting the tomb of Psamtik at Saqqara. We hope you enjoyed your journey.
Okay, so this was a very short demo. We are really working to make possible for the user of this app to study the sarcophagus in its own tomb, and later on to have also the texture of the all tomb walls. The tomb is, by the way, object of an epigraphic survey and an archaeological mission by a colleague, Ramadan Hussein from Tübingen. So we are really looking forward to cooperate with them and have a full immersive experience for this beautiful object and for the whole tomb. And so the scope of this project is to explore the variegated dimensions of the ancient Egyptian funerary religion, magic, and sacred spaces through immersive experience and visualizations. And we hope that with this project we are showing how immersive visualization technologies also provide access in new ways to cultures and experiences that are inaccessible or lost, giving us both the means of preserving the diversity of human cultural experience and a way to understand cultural diversity and the role of empathy in a global context. And key here is the dissemination of Egyptology content to the public, creating new ways for students and museum visitors to engage in meaningful ways with scholarly content, content that harnesses real scholarship and current research, but packages it in a way that is approachable and understandable by the public. And so after this short presentation, I also want to take, forgot to say that we have at UC Berkeley a few installations. One of them is actually at the archaeological research facilities of what we call the cave kiosk, and those are 3D environment that I'm using also for teaching, and where we can show those 3D models, the reconstructions with a better view, so the students can get more engaged in studying archaeology in general, not only Egyptian archaeology. And as I said, a few words still to mention other 2 archaeological projects that we have at UC Berkeley. One is directed by my colleague Carol Redmond. It's an archaeological mission at Elibe in Beni Suef, almost 300 kilometers south of Cairo. And Elibe site is key to understanding ancient Egyptian history, since it was a capital during the 3rd intermediate period of the Egyptian history, so around the beginning of the 1st millennium BC. And the site is especially popular for a lot of findings already in the past of papyri, but archaeologically speaking, it had some very massive walls built by the high priest of Amun at Thebes to separate them from the kings of Egypt at Tanis. So in the north, this was a period indeed of divide between the priest and the kings that were formally together, but through the archaeological missions like those, we understand more about historical periods which are very dense and hard to understand for Egyptologists. So the mission is still ongoing. It has, of course, right now is freezed as well as all archaeological missions, but my colleague hope to resume it soon. And the last project I wanted to mention is the Abydos Temple Paper Archive project, which is an international mission under the auspices of the University of California, Berkeley, in collaboration with the Ministry of Antiquities, Egypt, with members from several countries, including many Egyptian team members and others from our department, Near Eastern Studies. Carol Redmond, again, is directing this project. Our already PhD postdoc, we could say Jessica Kaiser is one of the directors. We have many other students, graduate and undergraduate involved in these projects. And this project is about discovering and studying those historical archives that were abandoned in the site, as you can see in this photo, and that instead contain documents from the Egyptian Antiquities Service related to the heritage management of the site of Abydos and surrounding areas. So they found documents approximately from the 1850 to the 1960s. So the focus is to preserve and categorize this historical archive detailing the modern history of the area and its archaeological sites from also the Egyptian point of view. And so it's very, very useful for our for reconstructing the history of Egyptology. And with this, I'm done with Egypt, so we can move again with the next speaker that I may introduce, Benjamin Porter, Associate Professor of Middle Eastern Archaeology at our department, Near Eastern Studies, and is an archaeologist, but also an anthropologist, who studies the Bronze and Iron Age societies of the Middle East and Mediterraneans, and directs various field projects, but maybe Ben himself wants to say more about those projects and focusing on one in particular. Please, Ben.
Hi, thank you, Rita. I hope everyone can see me. This is a very exciting collaboration, and I'm very happy to be a part of it. The thing I'd like to talk about today is a new project. Before I do that, let me put a little bit more into context. But the last 10 years, I've become very interested in the ways that archaeologists around the world can use collections that have collections, mortuary collections that have been excavated over the past century, that are now kept in museum collections and antiquity collections And perhaps these collections have not been particularly well published, or they've been underpublished, or perhaps they've been overpublished, but the new kinds of questions that we're asking about mortuary practices in the past have not yet been asked. And so I think this is an important complementary strategy to active field research. So one project that I kicked off about a decade ago that involves a very interesting collection at the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology at UC Berkeley, where I'm also a faculty curator of Middle Eastern archaeology and a past director of the museum. I kicked off a project with my colleague at Sonoma State University, Dr. Alexis Boutan, where we were looking at a collection that was excavated in the 1940s by an archaeologist named Peter B. Cornwall on the island of Bahrain, which is located in the Persian Gulf. In the lower right-hand screen, you can see one of our early publications that was an overview of the collection. And we've gone on to publish several articles that are looking at how we can use 21st century both bioarchaeological techniques as well as mortuary archaeological techniques to study this museum collection. And it's borne a lot of fruit. We've been able to make, I think, important contributions to the ways that we think about the Bronze Age civilizations of one kingdom in particular named Dilmun. Our project inspired us to develop another project that brought our colleagues into conversation with us. And these conversations were published in a book published by the University of Colorado Press called Remembering the Dead in the Ancient Near East. And you can see that located in the lower left-hand corner. But today I want to talk about a new project that I've started, but it's along a similar theme of looking for undervalued mortuary evidence and trying to ask new questions with them. And that's at the archaeological site of Tel al-Mazar, which is located today in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Could I have the next slide, Rita? Good. So here you can see a map of the southern Levant, where between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan Rift Valley, you have the state of Israel, you have the Palestinian West Bank, and then the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. This is located, the site Tel al-Mazar is located not far from the northern shore of the Dead Sea, not far from the very famous Neolithic site of Jericho. And in the lower right-hand part of the screen, you can see satellite imagery of Tel al-Mazar. It was located in the Iron Age. And we'll be talking about mainly the 5th and 4th centuries BCE in a moment. But Tel al-Mazar was located in the Jordan Valley, which in antiquity was a rather marshy area, perhaps good for agriculture. It was also located on a major commercial thoroughfare that linked the southern Levant and the northern Levant, as well as Mediterranean coastal ports. So this is very much on the edge of the, if you might say, the traditional Mediterranean basin and the ancient Middle Eastern world. The next slide, please. So the time period I'm interested in asking this question is during the period in which the Achaemenid Persian Empire ruled a good portion of the Middle East. You can see a map on the upper right-hand corner. This empire extended from Western Turkey all the way to the Indus River Valley in what is today Pakistan. And at times there was even control over parts of Egypt. So the base of the Achaemenid Empire was in southwest Iran at some of the famous capitals like Persepolis and Susa. And so the Tel al-Mazar was quite far from the imperial core, but the Jordan Valley and the Levant in particular were key for two particular reasons. One was the Levant was an agricultural breadbasket that supplied food, not just for Egypt, but also the northern Levant and of course local populations. The second reason it was an important location is that it was a coastal gateway for Mesopotamia into the Mediterranean. And so the coastal ports along the Mediterranean coast, like the ancient cities of Tyre and Dor, were key. And so the peoples of Tel al-Mazar and the peoples of the Jordan Valley lived a stone's throw, if you will, from these more active and perhaps more cosmopolitan Mediterranean ports. And so the site of Al-Mazar and its counterparts in the Jordan Valley served as a very important sort of agricultural node between Mesopotamia and between the Mediterranean ports. And I think this is important too, is what in a moment we're going to see just what their cemetery looked like. The next slide, please. So, of course, I did not excavate Tell el-Mazar. It was excavated by an excellent team from the University of Jordan between 1977 and 1981. This was an important teaching project for the University of Jordan, and many Jordanian archaeologists of that generation trained here when they were young scholars. What's really useful about this, this project is they went on to publish the biological data and the mortuary evidence from the cemetery that was located just off the site of the Tell. And they published it in a way that, even though it was published in 1984, and you can find this book if you're interested, there was a very good information about biological data of the different individuals that were buried here. There was age data, sex, biological sex, and then images about how bodies were interred, what position they were laid in, as well as grave goods. And so the entire cemetery was not excavated. And today, unfortunately, it's not available for excavation. It's now part of the agricultural environment of the Jordan Valley. But the team was able to excavate 85 largely single occupant interments that persons ranged in age from infants to senior adults. So you have a very nice population spread there to understand both children and young adults to the very elderly. And then among many of the observations that have already been made is that biological males and females received different burial treatments. If we had more time, we could take a look at how males and females' bodies were positioned differently. Biological male and biological female bodies were positioned differently, as well as the objects with which they were interred. So it raises a lot of interesting questions to be asking about identity and how that intersects with issues of gender and how those are memorialized in the mortuary context. Then also what's interesting, and to the credit of the original excavators, is they published a wide range of objects that were found in each of the interments. That gives us a very interesting insight into the mortuary assemblages that appeared in each cyst. And many of these objects were not just utilitarian ceramic vessels that one would expect, but there were also many luxury items. Here on the screen, you can see there's a very standard achimated seal and stamp seal and cylinder seal that were placed with these individuals. There was also bronze and iron objects that were used, say, for feasting. And then some individuals received slightly more treatment in their interment and were placed in these bathtub coffins. This is the object you see here in a profile, where these are bathtub coffins that are found throughout Mesopotamia in the middle part of the first millennium, as well as in the Levant. And so certain individuals were receiving slightly more treatment in death than others. And so this raises another question about about status and rank in these situations. And so the University of Jordan has given us a really great assemblage to ask new questions that were not asked in the past. And some of those questions I'll review on the next slide, Rita. The kinds of things I'm asking in this project is, what can the documented biological profiles tell us about Al-Mazar's overall health, and what was it like? The Jordan Valley, again, was often marshy. These were likely individuals who were participating in agriculture and also at the mercy of diseases like malaria. And so how are those conditions being expressed in the human skeleton? I'm also interested, as I hinted a moment ago, about the ideologies of death, burial, and the afterlife, and how that's encoded in the evidence. what do these assemblages tell us about the community's access to prestige good markets? I don't have time to show you all of the wonderful objects, luxury objects that are found here, but many of these objects have traveled from long distances. And so even though we might be exploring a community that was mainly based in labor, they seem to have access to prestige good markets. That's likely because of their community's location on an important commercial thoroughfare that ran the length of the Jordan Valley. And then finally, this is not the only cemetery in this style that dates to this period. We have two others that have been well published. One, you can see their publications here. One is located near the Bronze and Iron Age city of Carchemish on the Euphrates that was re-examined by Mori a few decades ago. And then there's also a publication from Kameda Lotz, which is in southern Lebanon, that also has a cemetery that dates to this time period. So what can we learn then about this, about these different communities by comparing these three cemetery assemblages? So that's what I'm interested in exploring for this new collaboration that we have with our Sicilian colleagues. And hopefully if you check back with me in a few more months, I'll have a lot more to say about this investigation. So thank you for listening, and I'll turn it back over to Rita now.
Thank you, Ben, for this really great presentation. So I think now we are at the last speaker of the day, Professor Nicola Lanieri, who teaches archaeology and art history of the ancient Near East at the University of Catania, and since 2003 has been the director of the Hirbe-Merdon Tepe Archaeological Project in Turkey, and is currently also the co-director of the Ganja Region Kurgan Archaeological Project in Azerbaijan. And I also want to add that I'm very happy to have been to have been working with Nicola for this visiting professorship been holding at the University of Catania. So we've been co-teaching a course for Egyptology, and it's great now to continue this cooperation also with the other colleagues of Catania. But well, I'll give the word to Nicola for now.
Thank you so much, Rita. And I know it's going to be a tiny little book, and it's possible to see anyway. I remember when I was a student of European prehistory reading this book by Maria Gimbutas on the Kurgans. I think a lot of my friends and colleagues here probably read this book in Italian. It was based on an article from 1956, if I remember wrong. And it was a diffusionist approach towards the idea of the spread of Kurgans together with Proto-Indo-European culture from the Pontic area all the way into Anatolia. So I kind of travel this idea of the Kurgans, of these funerary mounds, and a word that it's coming from Turkish language and has never been translated. The translation should be a burial mound. Has been lingering in my mind for a long while. Until 2018, when I kind of moved from Anatolia all the way to the Caucasus. And I started a project in collaboration with Azeri colleagues from the Academy of Science at the Institute of Ethnography and Archaeology at the Academy of Science of Baku, co-directing with Bakhtiar Jalilov this project in collaboration with the School of Religious Studies of Kamnes in Florence, the University of Catania. And the idea was to try to bring into the arena a clear investigation of these funerary mounds. So we decided to tackle two areas related to two creeks, the Ganja Creek and the Kuruk Chai Creek, affluent of the Kura River, as you can see in the plan, going from Anatolia into the Caspian Sea. One of the two rivers, together with the Arax River, they gave the name to one of the most famous culture of the Southern Caucasus, that is the Kura-Arax culture that dated between the 4th millennium BC and the 2nd millennium BC. So the idea was to tackle these funerary mounds that are marking the landscape of numerous Southern Caucasus nations, Western Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Eastern Anatolia. The tradition of the kurgan comes from the Pontic area, where during the 5th millennium, the large collective burials were constructed. Slowly, this tradition came down into the Southern Caucasus, between the Northern and the Lesser Caucasus. And this is where we are exactly located. The idea was thus to excavate on one side a Kura-Araxes kurgan that was part of the Uzun-Ramah Plateau in the Goranboy province, as I said before, along the Kurak-Chai affluent to the Kura River, and the other one was to tackle on the late Bronze. It means late 2nd millennium, beginning of the 1st millennium BC, the kurgans along near the modern city of Ganja. What we have done thus was, like, starting from 2018. Next slide, Rita, please. Was to clean and investigate the kurgan through a biographical approach. That means, like, see and understand the different layers of construction, use, and memorialization of these funerary mounds that raises about 2 meters from the ground. The Kura-Araxes kurgans are varied in terms of size, but generally between 15 and 20 meters of diameters. In particular, we focus on kurgan 8 after the my colleague Bakhtiar Jalilov excavated 7 kurgans dated to this period. In particular, as you can see from this slide, what we noticed immediately was that these funerary mounds was constructed using 2 different circles of stones. One that was the inner circle, and it was the top of the mound covering the funerary chamber. And the second one was a circle of stones around a kind of a path that was probably used for ritual purposes as a sort of circumambulation around the kurgan. So interestingly, last week we got 5 calibrated dates on seeds, human bones, and charcoals, and they are all steady in that range of 3,660 to 3,500 BC, making this the most ancient Kura-Araxes kurgan of all the Southern Caucasus and also in Eastern Anatolia. Next slide, please, Rita. As you can see from these photos, this picture put together by Lorenzo Crescioli with Photoscan, you can see the circles, but you can see that there are 2 different kurgans. One that is linked to the main funerary chamber, and the dromos linked to the corners of the cardinal points. And you can see those stones in black circling this funerary chamber that was 5 by 7 meters in size. The dromos was about 1.50 meters in length and 1 meter width. And next, tangent to this circle of stones, whereas there were another circle of stones, as you can see, were not centered on the funerary chamber. Why? Because this the funerary chamber dated to the Kura-Araxes was then reused during a later period. We think in terms of pottery chronology, the calibrated data were not very helpful, but in terms of pottery chronology, these 2 intrusive pit burials that you can see along the northern edge of the funerary chamber were dated to the early kurgan period. That means Middle Bronze Age, end of the Early Bronze Age, Middle Bronze Age. That is roughly between 2,600 to 2,300. So it's almost like 700, it's almost 1,000 years later. And on top of this, 2 graves was built a larger a larger kurgan that was used to include also the previous Kura-Araxes kurgan. We don't know if this is an act of memorialization, but considering the widespread area of the Uzun-Ramah Plateau, where there are more than 280 kurgans, we don't understand why they had to reuse exactly the same area. It is also interesting that this kurgan is probably the largest kurgan of the Kura-Araxes period, and the two graves that are located on the northern side of the funerary chamber didn't destroy the funerary chamber, but just touch along the edges of the funerary chamber. A third intrusive pit was instead used as a funerary favissa related to the use of the Kura-Araxes kurgan. Next slide, please. As you can see from this reconstruction, the dromus was used to enter, the dromus sloping down was used to enter the funerary chamber, and at least in three or four different phases, the bodies of the individuals were deposited using wooden sledges. And as you will see in the next slide, we saw these archaeological traces, the pattern of these wooden beams along the floor. As you can see, in one corner was located a sort of wooden coffin that was probably used as a chimney to make circulate air within the funerary chamber. Why? Because at the end use of these funerary chambers, after all the bodies were deposited, the funerary chambers and the dromus were burned from within, and at the end of the first phase of firing was also the beams were also burned from outside, allowing the whole structure to collapse within. What we also notice, as you can see, is that probably the funerary chamber during the use encountered a collapse of one of the wall, because as you can see, the cyst, the grave that was, the pit that was cut, was then bonded with Madrid walls circling around and creating a sort of house for these communities. What we know is that during this period, the communities were moving a lot, were either transhumant or nomadic communities moving from Georgia towards northwestern Iran and Armenia, crossing during seasonally the Lesser Caucasus, the borders Azerbaijan with Armenia. So during this period of occupation, this seasonal period of occupation of the area, the dead bodies of the members of the communities were buried inside. And at the end of the use of the funerary chamber, the chamber was burned down, and the funerary chamber was filled in with the virgin soil, the gypsum plaster virgin soil located around the kurgan. Next slide, please. So as you can see here from these three slides, all the beams were found almost intact, burned inside. So they collapse inside the funerary chambers at the end. Use of the kurgan, of the funerary chamber, and as you can see, even the whole architrave on top of the dromus were found. And as you can see in the corner, there was this sort of coffin chimney that was used probably to bury people, but also to allow air and fire to burn this chamber. As you can see, most of the human beings were burned inside, were all in primary depositions, and together with each phase of deposition of these human beings, usually we have found only one or two, usually a set of vessels composed of a bowl and a drinking vessel. As you can see in this case, it's clearly evident from this picture in the center, the human being was placed on, you can see the pattern, was placed on a sledge that was used probably to carry inside the funerary chamber the body of this individual. In concluding my presentation, what we want to do next year, and we hope some people from Berkeley will join us together with our students from the University of Catania, is to publish all the materials excavated by my colleague Bakhtiar Jalilov in a final volume, in a final report. They will include the Kurarax's kurgans together with the Iron Age kurgans of the Ganja region, and then we'll start excavating a settlement in the Astafa region farther north along the Kur in order to understand the relationship between the these kurgans and the settlements. So thank you to everybody. I think I'm the concluding speaker of today. I hope we were able to put together an interesting webinar. I've seen almost 170 people, probably even more, students from Berkeley, from the University of Catania. Is at the end of COVID allowed us to connect with no expenses, and that's like probably the best way of connecting Berkeley and Catania. I don't even know how much would cost a flight from Berkeley to Catania. And thank you, Rita. Thank you all. Thank you also the provost and the president of the University of Catania, the provost of UC Berkeley, for having signed this agreement. And hopefully there are questions.
Yes, indeed. We open now a short time for questions. If there are questions from the audience, or even if the speakers have questions for other speakers, of course. So I'll check also the chat space. Okay. Let's see. Any questions? Raise your hands. So
Yeah, Rita?
yes.
Yeah, there was a question, an interesting question that came on the YouTube chat. I think I'll take that one, about the source of the bronze and iron in the Mazar cemetery. I don't think there's been any specific sourcing that's been done on those specific objects. It's a good question. I think, however, I could speculate. There were a number of iron ores available in the foothills to the east and to the south of the settlement, where iron ores were mined probably during the Iron Age, and certainly later in the Classical and Islamic era. We have actually documented. So iron ores would be readily available to producers in the southern Levant. Bronze is a little bit more complicated, of course, because you need copper and tin. There was a major copper mining area in southwestern Jordan, but we don't have much evidence that it was being used at this time. It's being used both before and after this time. Another potential location for copper would have been Cyprus, of course, which was a major producer throughout the late second into the first millennium, albeit not consistently. So it's a great question, but we don't have the specific answer right now.
Great. And there are, I see other questions. One was for Professor Militello. Can you please repeat the date of the bones with the cut marks suggesting the fleshing?
Okay, I had already answered on the chat. C14 date gives a calibrated date of around 1850, 1750 BC. So we are just in what is called early Bronze Age. early Sicilian early Bronze Age. In European terminology, it's the transition between early and middle Bronze Age.
Exactly. Then there were other questions. One was, imagine the IM pay of Frank Gehry of the ancient Mediterranean. How would he be hired? How would he find working staff? Who would finance his projects? Who wants to answer that?
Okay, I have to say that this is not a question for Calicantono Caraforno, but it's perhaps a question for Festus. It's not a funerary monument, but I am just trying to find the answer for the same problem, especially because we are just in a peculiar moment of transition for less complex to more complex societies. Simona has an idea about how people was hired before, at the end of the early Minoan pre-palatial period. I think that in the case of Festus, however, in Crete, we are just in a more communal and corporative society. So my idea is that main labor force was provided by the community, whereas specialists came from outside. And probably I could not find evidence for the way how they were hired in metal or other kind of goods. But I think that in this case, in the case of Festus, we can have a kind of mix between a communal work, as suggested by Simona Todaro, who can perhaps give a better description of how she thinks people was hired in the preparation period and in the palatial period. I think in this case we have a communal participation for the not specialized man labor, whereas only specialists were hired from outside. I don't know if this can fit your answer for your period and your
okay, I might have just a few remarks on that, and it has to do mainly with the type of site Festus is, because starting from around mid of the third millennium, it stopped being a settlement and it was more like a ritual sites. And so what we could see, it was that at some point they start mobilizing a huge amount of labor to cut the hill. There is a lot of terracing. And in conjunction with this big work, we found the introduction of what I interpreted as Russian balls. They are little plain, like the Near Eastern one, but in Crete, they appear much later. In this case, we have these big construction fields with hundreds and hundreds of these plain balls that are mainly mold-made. So they are mold-made. That means that you can produce it a huge amount. You can put also a non-specialist to produce them. And mainly the mold can assure about the volume, the standardization of volume. And so in that case, it was clear that because nobody was inhabiting the place, whenever there was the need of conducting major collaborative work, there was this sort of meal distribution. I wouldn't even say redistribution because we don't have much evidence about the fact that at that early stage they are starting gathering together, but there was some sort of emerging authorities that was organizing and coordinating all these workmen. And so in this stage, we can see that there is this distribution of meal in the shape of meat and whatever kind of substance was provided with these little ration balls. And because that is the moment in which we have some sign that they start draining the marshy area. And so it's possible that, and it's also that we have some pollen dates, but they are not very well dated, that show that cereal starting appearing. So it's possible that there was a conjunction of new engineering capacity draining the marshy area. And so that allowed some sort of cultivation, intensive cultivation of grain, and therefore the redistribution model applied only for this type of communal work. And as Pietro explained before, for later period instead, it's more complicated, and it seems that I totally agree with him with this separation.
because what I wanted to stress is just that whereas until the end of the preparation period, we have this huge amount of rectangle, this disappear in middle Minono 1B. And this thing marks a change in the way people was hired. As far as the question of how specialists were paid, what I can say is in the linear A tablet, we can find evidence, for example, of wine, barley, grain, but also wool. So I can also think of this kind of raw material as a form of payment.
Thank you. I see in the chat there are questions for Kim and Ben. Maybe they want to answer.
Ben answered directly in the chat, right, Ben?
Yeah, but they can't read the chat, so I guess.
Oh, no, on the official chat on YouTube.
Ah, right.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
maybe there is a question Kim wants to answer.
Sure, there's actually two questions. One was about the warrior kit that I mentioned is something that we see that it's included with a number of our burials. And the question was about whether there's any evidence for other professions. I would say, though, that the warrior's kit, I wouldn't call the warrior a profession in the same way that I would say that this is a mark of identity. And in many cases, we don't yet have any evidence on the burial itself, on the skeletal material, that would suggest that they were anything more than just a cushy elite that sat around and did nothing. But by including all of this material, you at least give off the picture of being a warrior in your life and who's going to fight you after you're dead anyway. The exception, though, is we do in fact have one burial that was very well decked out with 2 swords and a dagger, but also a mirror and some other interesting bronzes, who died from let's call it sharp force trauma through the center of his forehead. So possibly a sword blow. So there's some that may actually have been doing that. We don't really have other yet evidence of professions within the artifact material. We do have one burial with the things that were found with them, including 24 bows and arrows and a leather quiver and a seal stone that showed different prey that a person was identifying themselves as a hunter rather than a warrior. And we may find some other indicators, of course, on the osteological material when it's more closely examined that indicates other kinds of professions through repeated activity. But that's still in the very early stages of study. There was just one other one about whether there's archaeological evidence linking the Archaic period's interaction with Homer. There's nothing particularly direct about that, starting in the Iron Age and going into the Archaic period. As we know that the Homeric epics were circulating very widely, we do see an intensification of people visiting sites that are linked to the Homeric epics. I've witnessed this many times at Mycenae, for instance, where there are certain places on the site that would have been visible and people interacted with, and there were often gifts left that are like the types of gifts we know from the funeral of Patroclus, which are not actually a terribly good reflection of what people give in late Bronze Age tombs. But then during the later Iron Age and the Archaic period, they start to leave these at Bronze Age tombs that they identify, they believe are these heroes that are being described, we think, in the epic. And we see that at Idonia now too.
So I guess Rita, it was almost 8 p.m. here. I think it's dinner time.
Yeah.
And I think I see reducing. We had a peak of 175. It was a great success. I guess we got like amazing comments, a lot of students. It was great. Thank you all. I mean, thank you for taking your time off and be part of this. I hope we're going to be able to organize like more specific webinar in the future. I mean, we have a summer, we don't know if we're going to go in the field and so it might be an occasion to just like exchange more ideas on other subjects. So thank you all. Thank you, Rita. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Nico.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And I hope to see you in person soon, all of you.
I hope very soon.
Bye.
Ciao. Bye bye.
Ciao. Bye.